It's now time for me to introduce Dr. Simon Longstaff, AO, who many of you will know as an eminent Australian. Dr. Longstaff commenced his work as the first executive director of the Ethics Centre, which he founded in 1991. This not-for-profit has successfully operated for 26 years, giving advice to governments and leaders all around the world. For a career professional that is presented with ethical challenges in everyday situation, Simon asks the question, what ought one do? These glasses really didn't make much difference. Simon has developed ethical patterns that help the professional answer this question. What ought one do? Simon has a degree from Cambridge University, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. He's a fellow of CPA Australia and in June 2016 was appointed an honorary professor at the Australian National University, based at the National Centre for Indigenous Studies. Formerly serving as the inaugural president of the Australian Association for Professional and Applied Ethics, Simon serves on a number of boards and committees across a broad spectrum of activities. He was formerly a fellow of the World Economic Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Simon Longstaff.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's very nice to be with you. It's an interesting time. I mean, it's fascinating. It's such a good setup for what I want to talk about too. It's as if between Bernie and Daniel, they'd scripted some introductions for my remarks. I should just make mention of the fact that I'm speaking today purely as Executive Director of the Ethics Centre, not representing FAAA. We have a rule on the board there that those sorts of comments are left to our chair and to the CEO. So just talking from that, but obviously the sorts of ideas I have inform the work that I do as part of that board. The Ethics Centre, as you heard, has been going actually a little bit earlier, since 1989. I'll just tell you a little bit about it because it'll help put some of these remarks in context. It's the only organisation of its kind in the world, and what distinguishes it is that we work across this incredibly broad spectrum of issues which have two bookends which are both to do with life and death. So at one end of the spectrum, we provide support to individuals and families in end-of-life situations where, actually you've probably come across this through your work with your clients. You'd know the circumstances where someone's family member, it'll happen to all of us I suppose, is very close to the end of the life, and the medical profession can make available to you the option to continue to bring treatments to bear. And you might do so not realising that there's a key distinction that needs to be made between, on the one hand, the very noble intention of trying to prolong life, but you can use exactly the same medical technology to make someone die very slowly. That's all you do. You extend the process of dying rather than extend the process of life. And unless you know that distinction, unless somebody points it out and helps you to work it through, you might quite inadvertently become complicit in doing something that you would never choose to do for someone you love. That's one end of the life and death spectrum that we deal with. The other end is to do with the preparation of Australian Defence Force personnel for deployment to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where they have to deal with the challenges of asymmetric warfare. It's a radically different area to your own, although on some days you might not think it's too far removed. But in that world where in any direct contest of arms we will prevail, we're better armed, better trained, better supported, the enemy knows that. And so what they seek to do instead is to defeat us by different means, not through the use of kinetic force. Their weapon that they use against us is provocation of a kind that they hope might lead us to be indiscriminate or disproportionate in the use of force, where we might kill women or children, innocent bystanders, and cause the kind of outrage that would lead the Australian public to demand the recall of those forces. So our, if you like, our Achilles heel is not to do with weaponry, it's to do with the fact that our moral authority can be destroyed and our will to engage lost as a result of that, as we've seen in other encounters involving the Americans and many different types of forces in the world. So that's the spectrum. Now what we deal with in between those two poles, so we work with sporting bodies like the Australian Olympic Committee. You might have seen some controversy during the year. We conducted a review of the culture of the AOC and looking at its ethical foundations. And banks and mining companies, all sorts of people, not just in Australia but also overseas. Sometimes creating safe spaces for people to have very difficult conversations, sometimes providing tools, diagnosis and things like that. I mention that because, strangely enough, both parts of that spectrum have been invoked in part during the course of the conversation I've heard so far today. There's been a lot of discussion of surgeons, for example, doctors and surgeons, and I think for good reason, but I don't think people quite understand just what is the history of surgeons and how relevant it is to the thing that was announced today. So let me tell you a little bit about this, because it goes, Phil, to your question about what's in it for the business, what impact will it make, and it's actually positive but very profound. So in 1162, the then Pope issued an edict which banned monks in the Catholic Church, which of course then was the only church in Western Europe. It banned them from shedding blood. And as a result of that, it meant that anyone who might have been able to perform surgery was barred from doing so amongst the most qualified people, because hospitals back then, in the Middle Ages, were effectively religious institutions staffed by monks who performed all of the medical and nursing requirements. And so now you've got a whole branch of what was actually for those days reasonably sophisticated surgical procedures being denied to patients because of this edict from the Pope. So there's a breach that opens up, and into the breach come the barbers, because the barbers were people who were used to cutting things and using knives and things like that, and they were skilled. And so they rubbed together, and eventually you see in 1540 the establishment, in fact it's decreed, again this time by secular authorities, that they need to establish a guild, which is the Barbers' Surgeons Guild. And that's the reason when you see the red and white stripy pole outside barbershops sometimes, it's because the white's the hair and the red was the blood. The bloodletting, they used to, actually barber surgeons used to have a bowl of blood in the front window. It was disgusting, but there it was. Now at that time, from about that middle of the 16th century onwards, there were two types of doctors that you could see, and they were distinguished by the length of the robes they used to wear. So there were the short robes and the long robes. I think the short robes were the barber surgeons and the long robes were the others, the physicians. And they were distinguished by whether or not they were part of the guild structure, as the barber surgeons were, or whether or not they were part of a profession. Because the guilds were commercial entities. They brought together people with all sorts of different trades and commercial interests, drapers, cutlers, and in fact, they were all ranked. There was a hierarchy that existed within certainly the British system of guilds, which was represented each year when the guilds would march through the City of London. And those that were most admired, the most senior, would be number one in the list, and then they'd sort of form up in ranks behind there. And the barber surgeons were well and truly down that list. They were sort of in the 30s. I think they may have got to 27 or something like that on their best year. So we're not here talking about highly respected individuals within a society like Britain. We're talking about run-of-the-mill, highly skilled tradespeople who are participating within the market. And then in 1745, the surgeons who had been part of the guild, they departed. Now, the last barber surgeon in the world, at least in the British Isles, didn't die until the 1820s. So it wasn't as if everybody said he's snuffed, but there was a fundamental decision, a bit like what was announced this morning, in which, no, it's a bit like your decision 10 years ago after hearing Roger Corbett. You're saying, okay, I don't want to be a barber surgeon, I'm going to be just a surgeon. In the sense I'm going away, I'm going to find other like-minded individuals. And that moment was very profound because there are two worlds that coexist quite comfortably beside each other that are organised according to radically different principles. And we make a free choice at some point in our life as to which of those two worlds we want to be part of. Now, the largest part of that world is the world of the market, and by far and away most people belong to that world, as did the barber surgeons. And from the 18th century onwards, the idea of the market, not just as a meeting place where people would come to trade, but the concepts around the market were defined, and to this day they still are extraordinarily powerful. The ideas of people like Adam Smith and others. He was a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow, but his first great book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, almost no one's ever heard of that, but nearly everyone has heard of The Wealth of Nations. It's picked up time and time again. Now, in The Wealth of Nations, what Smith said was that it's not through benevolence or regard for the welfare of any other person that either the butcher, the brewer, the baker, or in this case the barber surgeon, makes provision for their dinner or for their medical treatment. He said it's got nothing to do with that. It's entirely and quite legitimately a matter of self-interest. People will do what is in their interest for them, and they will, through what he called the invisible hand, operate in a system which leads to an increase in the stock of common good. And that's one of the things about the market. I mean, it actually has an objective test as to its value and worth. That is, does it make us all better off? Markets have no intrinsic value. They're tools. And they do this through the pursuit of self-interest, through the satisfaction of wants. And so the paradigm might be somebody coming into a corner store, they're after a bit of chocolate, they look around the shelves, they find what they want, say some dairy milk, they go up to the merchant. The only thing the merchant wants to know is, can you pay the tariff? And if they can, take the cash, off they go with their chocolate. Now that's one world, okay? The legitimate pursuit of self-interest in the satisfaction of wants. Then there's this other world. It's the world of the professions, the world that the surgeons left the barbers from in 1745. It took them then until 1800 actually to establish themselves as a profession. So it wasn't that you're going pretty well compared to the surgeons. And this world is based on a complete reversal of that. So what a profession is defined by is a commitment to act in a spirit of public service, and it's in the service of interests, not the satisfaction of wants. So those people who say, whether it's just out of uni or now as you're doing, we wish specifically to be part of a profession, it's a choice we wish to make, what you're saying is we wish to enter the world in which we will subordinate our self-interest. It's going to come down the chain. It's not like the market where it's the number one concern. This is, 2 or 3 notches below. Because all professions have an overriding public interest that they serve, and then typically clients come next, and there might be something around their own profession, and then and only then do you get to say, well, what's good for me as an individual? And rather than satisfying wants, they serve interests. So to go back to the paradigm example I gave of the person after some chocolate going into the merchant, it's just pay the money and I'll give it to you, and I'm doing it simply because, it's good for me to sell and for you to buy. But walk in to a doctor's surgery, that exactly same person walking into a doctor's surgery and saying, doctor, look, I'm looking for some chocolate. And if the doctor knows they're a diabetic, they're going to have not a moment of hesitation to say, I know what you want. I can hear that. Okay, I've got that bit. But it's not in your interests that I should provide it, and therefore I refuse to do so. Doctor, come on, I've got a pockets full of cash, I just want some chocolate. Sorry. I know what you want. I know how lucrative it could be, but I am bound as a member of a profession not to give you what you want. What I have to do is use all of my skill and experience to discern where your interests lie and to act accordingly. Now, if you'd said to the surgeons in 1745, which kind of bet is going to lead to greater success, quality of life and all the rest, I think people might have said, oh, look, stick with the market. This is a pretty good thing. It's reasonably sure. You can pursue your self-interest. You can control what you do and don't do. But what, of course, we saw is that in a very short period of time, relatively to human history, the surgeons entered into the social compact which society makes with the professions. Because remember, we understand this as a society. The professions, we know what it means to choose not to pursue self-interest, that it's a cost. So what society does is it says, well, we'll give you certain things in recognition of that choice. So we'll reserve certain types of work that only you can do. Not anybody can just whip out an appendix on the kitchen table. There's a general expectation that you've been licensed by society to do that, as with others, like audits and things like that. We'll do that. We'll accord you a certain status and respect. And we will reasonably expect, although there may be some variation, that you will prosper in a material sense as well in the course of doing this. Which, of course, is what happens. You say, well, I had my hair cut earlier this week. Probably all of us do, a number of times in the year. So it's still an important service that's being provided. The people who do it are still skilled. But if you ask who got the better end of the deal, the barbers or the surgeons, when you look at them doing an operation and they're going off to play golf and the houses they live in, the esteem with which they're held and things like that, you've got to say that was a good bet. That was the choice worth making. It's not as if they come. So this is the answer to your question. A long way of getting there is think about the bet that you're going to make. Think about what history leads us to believe about that. But also know, and this comes back to Daniel's point, that you only get those benefits if the promise you make is fair income. And you've seen what happened to the legal profession. When they started to drift away a little bit and say, oh, I'm just running a business in the law, so I'll be as commercial as the plumber who's got a business in plumbing things and this and that, then society started to reduce its licence in terms of the social compact, so conveyancing is thrown open, because the profession, through its members, was no longer making as credible a claim as it used to do. So you can't sort of say, I want all the benefits without any of the commitment and the cost that this will mean. And there is a cost. There's a cost in terms of time, educational things, the kind of interpersonal accountability that Daniel was talking about in relation to ethical standards. Remember, professions hold each other accountable. It's not the government doing it, it's you holding each other accountable. You look around this room, you're a small enough group to know what each and every one of you does for this to be an important choice to make. So it can be remarkably beneficial if it's done for the right reasons with proper commitment and then done in a way that holds each other accountable. And the one thing that the professions are not good at is that what they're good at is holding each other accountable in the sense of punishing each other if you get it wrong. What they're hopeless at in this country is supporting each other when you try to do something right. You just don't see it. Hardly ever does a profession stand up for one of its members who's trying to do the right thing. So you've got a great opportunity to get that right with the formation of this new body. So why do this? Why do this at the moment? Well, one reason might be that there's this kind of lash of necessity. The government has clearly formed a view about this. The board I'm on, FAAA, is about establishing minimum education standards and CPD and a code of ethics. So it's got a lot of these attributes around explicitly helping a large number of people in a short period of time to move towards a professional status. How many people will truly put their heart in that or just say, oh, well, that's something I have to do, or leave the industry, is difficult to tell. So one account you could give is, look, it's just basically something we have to suck up and do. But I think that's to misunderstand, in a quite profound sense, the particular context in which this is now being done, and in a sense of the urgency. And this goes to some of the things that Bernie in particular was talking about. We are living at an extraordinary time. I mean, it's not too often that humans get to live through a moment of genuine civilisational transformation, but it is happening. The technologies which are now being developed and deployed are going to cause, well, as I say, civilisational change. The banks in 10 years will have 50% less employees. Most of them will probably have sold their wealth businesses, probably all of them. So the landscape will there. Accounting firms, the people who own the buildings down at Barangaroo, places like that, they're already factoring in a 40% decline in occupancy. Law firms and accounting firms, partly because of outsourcing to Warsaw, things like that, expert systems. Artificial intelligence, despite the worries about it, and there are reasons to be worried because there are, particularly when you get to neural networks, there are supervised and unsupervised neural networks in terms of machine learning. Unsupervised networks, we don't know how they work, just that they do. So we don't have any ultimate control. They're not operating to a kind of Boolean logic where you can track everything back. But the transformation that this is going to have on our societies is going to be profound. And optimistic people say, oh, well, look at the history. Whenever there's been technological innovation, it's always been followed by adjustments leading to a further increase in the amount of work that people do. But that's to fail to understand that sometimes induction doesn't work like that. In fact, it produces very different outcomes. And not all societies have been based as we have, where a person's sense of value and meaning has come from a job. I mean, ancient Athens, although its economy was supported by a pernicious institution like slavery, most people didn't have a job. They didn't work in the sense in which we think about it, clocking on in the morning. They derived meaning as citizens by the quality of their citizenship, going to the courts, doing other things. They had a rich sense. And on this continent, prior to the Europeans, Indigenous people didn't have jobs in the way that, you think about it. They lived incredibly rich lives where very little of the day was spent doing anything like work in the sense of hunting or fishing. There was often prodigious amounts of food available for very little effort. So their day was full of meaning in relation to things like storytelling, ceremony, being with family. These were rich and meaningful lives. And our society seems to have forgotten that it's possible, and I think this is where we're going to have to go, actually, is to recreate new senses of what meaning is for us in our lives, which is not necessarily attached to a job. And so you then think, well, what's going to happen to the economy? Where is the resources? Where are the resources for government going to come from? They'll come from some people, but Bernie's table, with 2 people being held up, actually isn't going to be held up by 2.5 people. It might be, but it's actually going to be 2.5 people and a whole lot of robots. And what society will do is tax the means of production as it has before. Where's the wealth being generated? It'll be generated out of robots and dark factories where the lights are never turned on, which produce. There'll be microfabrication taking place where you've got molecular 3D printing. There'll be so many different things that'll be happening. But there will always be a role for a certain group of people. And this brings me back to the surgeon and then back to you and the comparison and why it's so apt. Because if you look today, IBM Watson has a more accurate estimation of, for example, in diagnosis of cancer than any human doctor. With its massive database, it's able to scan your particular tests, whatever they are, whether they're through pathology or biopsy, whatever, and they can, with a much higher level of accuracy, work out whether or not you've got a cancer, and if so, what it happens to be. With the ability now to sequence the human genome, it's $1,000 for any of us, complete sequencing. You can have pharmacogenomics coming on, where not only will you won't have a generic drug, you'll have a drug which is specifically tailored to your genome, which may offer you relief, may even offer some cures with gene therapy and millions of other things. But the point is, even if IBM Watson is able to provide you with the most accurate estimate of your condition, do you want Watson to be saying to you, "I'm sorry, Simon, I have to tell you you have cancer. And the best we know is that you have 6 months to live"? The answer is, I think, no matter how accurate the simulation might be that we can produce through androids and robotics, human beings will want somebody who is actually mortal and knows what it means to be facing death, to be the person who puts their hand on their arm or shoulder and says, "I'm sorry. We'll do what we can, but this is where you're going." That can't be done by a robot. In your world of financial advice, where people are looking for meaning, where they're dealing still with death and disease, I think Bernie's right. I mean, the expert systems will fill in the forms and they'll provide the mechanisms to make more efficient planning possible. But I already hear stories. I know my dad, who's in hospital at the moment, he's 87 and getting pretty close to the end. Thought he'd die last week. He's told me, and I found it astounding, that some of the deepest conversations he's had about inheritance, succession, his family, they've not been with his doctor, they've been with his financial advisor, who've sat with him and listened and brought a degree of insight to bear in relation to that, which has got nothing to do with numbers. And so what I think will become a particular challenge for your mob is developing a kind of ethical literacy that enables you to have those conversations. That will be, I think, an essential component of the skill set. I don't know whether people think about it now. I suspect when you've had those conversations with your clients, you've drawn more on your own experience, kind of a general sense, being open to listening, things like that. But actually there are skills around ethical literacy which can be learned, and I think there will be a responsibility to provide. And that's part of the education that I think you should be thinking about as you develop your own skills. And who is this going to be for? Well, I share Bernie's altruistic ambition. It's got to be for everybody, every Australian. You have got all of the marks that you tick for a profession. It's not just those commitments to public interest and things like that. There's also an asymmetry of knowledge. You would, look, I'm pretty smart, you know, in terms of, I understand philosophy and this and that. You'd run rings around me if we sat down trying to do anything. You know more than I do about so much stuff. So I am in a weaker position there relative to you whenever it comes to these things. So because of that asymmetry of knowledge, I'm going to be totally reliant on your goodwill, your character, your commitment. But it shouldn't be just because I can afford it that I'm going to get good financial advice. It should be open to every Australian who, for some of these demographic reasons to do with, you know, intersection of technology, work, society, are going to really need good advice, whether there's a universal basic income or something else. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, I think part of the answer might be in the sort of lowering of marginal costs through technology. I'm actually also interested in a public policy option, which is to introduce the equivalent of legal aid. I actually think if we took a small clip out of all of the funds under management throughout the Australian super industry and established a statutory fund, it could be applied to by you. You could build practices providing financial advice of an equal quality to those who can, you know, afford to pay it, to those of very modest means who can't afford but deserve the same kind of support in the kind of society we have. The net wealth of the nation would hardly notice a tiny percentage. The fund would accumulate over a period of time, and individual planners or groups on their behalf would be able to make application to provide funds to provide that advice. And I think it's a no-brainer as a matter of public policy, and just as we think of legal aid as being an essential component for every citizen to ensure that no one is denied justice on the basis of their means, so we should consider this. Do I think it's that important? So that's where I'm going to sort of wind up in terms of formal remarks. happy to take questions, and please don't feel you have to agree with me. I mean, you can challenge, disagree, whatever. But hopefully this has laid some thinking, particularly on such a seminal day as this, where you're making that announcement around IFAAA. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Simon? Yes.
Simon, just checking in, there was a gap of, I think, from when did the Pope make that decision about the monks?
1162 to
and then you skip forward to 1500.
1540, yeah. So what happened was they weren't formal. What they did is the barbers just went in and started doing the job, but they had no formal. They didn't have any kind of formal status around it, and so it was completely unregulated. And so they did all the work. It stayed part of the marketplace. Their services were brought in. It was only in 1540 that the state sought to regulate it by establishing them as a formal guild.
So you're saying we're 10 years into a 400-year journey?
No, what I'm saying is you're already sort of... I mean, as I said, it was 1745 when the surgeons left the guild, and it took them till 1800 to get their royal charter as a profession. So you're done in 10 years what they took ages longer to do. So it's 50 or 60 years. I actually think this is going to be a remarkably swift thing. I think it's going to be actually, if you were a sociologist interested in looking at how societies change, you'd pick this as just absolutely amazing, because you're talking about potentially tens of thousands of people coming to this point. And this is going to be the test for the people like the FPA and the IFAAA as to whether they... I know people like Dana. I've been talking about this too for quite a long time with the financial advice about the possibilities of this. And people can say it all and say the words, but you also see that there's a kind of reluctance that people can have in relation to whether they're really willing to commit to what it means to be this kind of person. It's for that reason it's often referred to as a vocation, to be a lawyer or an engineer or a doctor or something. It's going to have the same feeling to it, and that's going to require really significant leadership from the industry.
Just on that, I'm sure everybody in this room, all the members of this association would agree with that vision that you've outlined of a sort of vocation, a higher standard. But for many of the industry, they're unwilling to take those steps. And it seems like the government's approach has been you either need to be a member of a profession or you need to be out. Do you think that there is scope for something in between, more akin to the long robe and the short robe, the barber surgeon, where there are people who are financial product salespeople unable to be members of a profession but not forced out entirely?
Look, it's possible they will. As I said to you, the last barber surgeon didn't die until the 1820s. So they sort of, there were people who stayed in the market. And it was just a declining trade, basically. I don't know that's really a matter for government policy as to whether they're going to allow any kind of exception. I think if they did, there'd be a stampede amongst a certain group towards saying, look, that's good enough for me. But I think because of some of the potential risks in doing that, I very much doubt that the government would allow that degree of freedom. I think they've probably settled on a course, and that's where they're heading. The problem will be that you'll have quite a lot of people, I think, who may leave and do something else as a result, because they don't want... I don't think it's just that they don't want to have be a pain in the bum to do all this extra work. It's they probably won't even believe in the idea of what I'm saying. They'll have been used to some other way of doing things which doesn't require this kind of reflective practice, which necessarily is part of a profession.
Susanna.
Hi, Simon. As part of the application for an occupational scheme with the Professional Standards Council comes a development of a code of ethics and a code of conduct. Just as an advisor myself, how would that adhering to a code of ethics or a code of conduct play out in my life as a financial advisor on a day-to-day basis?
I should say I was one of the first founding members of the Professional Standards Councils when they were established, so I know this scheme well. First thing is, it's going to depend in your world a little bit as to what agreements can be reached with ASIC around this. What the legislation makes clear, at least in relating to financial advice, is that it contemplates a distinction between a code of ethics and a code of conduct. And so there are various sections in the legislation and guidance around this. A code of ethics is not defined, but they are different things, and so it's going to depend which bit you're talking about. Properly understood, and this isn't always actually the way you see it expressed in reality, properly understood, a code of ethics is typically an expression that captures core values, core principles, and a defining purpose. So there's got to be some good that the profession exists to serve. If you ask lawyers, they will say, well, the particular good that we're about is the administration of justice. Accountants will tell you the good that we're built around is truth. Engineers, safety and well-being. Doctors, it'll be health. So you've got to say, for financial advice, what's the good, the defining good that you are using to calibrate what you do? Knowing that, what then are the core values and principles that we have? Now, a code of conduct is a different beast. It's a series of non-negotiable rules. It's like a set of regulations which are imposed. And my own view is that codes of conduct should be as short as possible. In other words, they should only specify as being required or prohibited a minimum number of things which are absolutely necessary. And that instead members of the profession should be far more often held accountable instead to the application of core values and principles. Now, they are necessarily more vague. But they don't give you the bright line to move up to. So what will change for you if that sort of thing unfolds is you will be invited, whenever engaging in professional conduct, to think about whether the thing you are doing or proposing to do is consistent with those core values and principles in the service of that defining purpose, and be willing to defend your conduct with reasons for how that was given practical application. So it won't be that you will necessarily be driven, in my view, into ticking boxes or doing something precisely the same as somebody in a different environment, because that stifles the ethical capacity to make responsible choices. More likely will be that you will do something which might be slightly different. And if somebody from the community or a colleague has a question, you have got to be able to expect how you can give a credible explanation of how what you did was consistent with that, which isn't just about rationalising self-interest or something like that. If you cannot give those reasons, if you're not equipped to do that or you haven't thought about it, then you'll likely be held culpable by your profession. So it's going to require you to move, and I don't know what it's like for you at the moment in terms of how things are organised, but some people are organised around compliance, where they follow a set of defined procedures, they tick boxes, they don't really think about it because the system does the work for them, to a world in which you need to be a reflective practitioner. Think about it and be prepared to give an account of the reasons you've acted upon.
One more question and then we're going to break for
Be
morning
very
tea.
quick. Just whether or not you can be a profession like insurance broking or selling pharmaceuticals, where you're trying to incentivise professionals to make a particular recommendation that also has a commission. So when you're getting paid from two sources to give the same advice, so a fee from a client and then a commission from an insurer, let's say, as an insurance broking profession, or what financial planners do, can you actually call yourself a professional if that is your remuneration structure?
So I think there's all sorts of difficulties. So my inclination would be, I don't want to say completely no. I'll tell you why, because you're with a law firm, right? Yep. Okay, you'll know senior counsel in a series of commercial enterprises who, despite being employees of that corporation, despite having all of the pressures around the need to make commercial decisions, will nonetheless reserve for themselves a space which is where their professional obligations come into effect. So if they have a practising certificate, they will never, or should never, act in any way which would be inconsistent with their obligations as an officer of the court. So we can imagine, as opposed to people who are in sole practice or in partnerships. So the degree, if you like, the thickness of the ethical skin that you have has to sort of grow depending on the context in which you operate. So it is possible to conceive, for example, of somebody being an employee of a corporation who is still a professional in the same way that a lawyer can be an employee or an engineer can and other things, if that's explicit and understood. But when you start to put in signals of any kind, whether you're a professional or not, that actually says to somebody, what we really want you to do is X, when we keep saying we sort of believe in Y, then it's not just that it sort of starts to challenge the professional ethos, it's actually hypocritical and inconsistent. So there are reasons other than just the profession for not doing that. And I think, just as Roger Corbett was talking about in that speech 10 years ago, why would you set up a system which actually has that effect? And I'll say one last thing. All of the behavioural economics shows that these sorts of incentives don't actually work in a positive sense. Putting a lot of value at risk actually depresses performance rather than inspires it. But it's a subject for another time.